forgiveness a moral minefield, you might say, how come? Forgiveness is good for you. There's so much research out there which shows that having a forgiving attitude actually produces very good health outcomes, both mentally and physically. It restores the person who's been hurt, and it restores the person who's harmed. So why is it then so problematic? In 2002, in the lead up to the war in Iraq, as a journalist, I felt compelled to find stories that were different to the stories of the time, which were very much around retaliation and revenge and payback and tit for tat. And so it really is a personal project, because I was a freelance journalist. I went around, and I was travelling quite a lot with a photographer who took the photographs. We collected stories which were very countercultural, and all of them really reflected the philosophy, really, of drawing a line under the dogma of vengeance. They were stories from victims and perpetrators of crime and violence. And I went on then to found the Forgiveness Project, which is, really uses the real-life stories of real people, victims and perpetrators of crime and violence, to explore concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation and restorative justice. Now, the response over the years, this was in 2004 when I started, the response over the years has been overwhelmingly positive. But just every now and again, forgiveness really seems to offend some people in certain contexts. So, mostly, as I said, the response is overwhelmingly positive, but 2 years ago I got a letter from Norman Tebbit, who was, for those of you that don't know, a Conservative politician in Margaret Thatcher's government. And his letter ended with these words, I don't know if you can read it. Your project excuses, rewards, and encourages murder. And I'll come back to that, the context of that letter. But overwhelmingly positive response. Oh, sorry. This is much more usual. I want to thank the project for sharing, for being available. I'm going through something very difficult in my life right now. It's as though I'm walking a mountain ridge. To one side lies the barren valley of anger, and to the other runs the river of forgiveness and inspiration. On a daily basis, I receive emails like that. I called the exhibition which I created in 2004 the F word. Got there before Gordon Ramsay, I have to say. And the reason I called it the F word is because I realised forgiveness really cuts public opinion down the middle like a guillotine. There are people who are inspired by it, who see it as the only way of not allowing the wounds of the past affecting the path of the future. And there are people who are absolutely affronted by it, who see it as a cheap thing, as easy as a cop-out, as really just allowing people to get off the hook and excusing offences. And this is just an image of how the exhibition looked and what then later came was the Forgiveness Project, which is a charity that works in prisons and schools. So what is forgiveness? You know, it's something I've grappled with over these years. I actually think the more I think about it, the less I know. But I'm very comfortable with that position, actually. The dictionary definition is giving up resentment and the desire to punish. Desmond Tutu says to forgive is not just to be altruistic, it's the best form of self-interest. And Mark Twain, the American writer, says that forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that crushes it. I really like that explanation, it's very poetic. Forgiveness is such a tricky subject. It's a choice, it's personal, it's difficult, it's painful, it's costly. It's not a one-off event, it's not a panacea for all ills, it's not some magical key to serenity, but, and this is really what interests me, it's potentially transformative. Everyone has their opinion about what forgiveness is and what it isn't, so I'm sure you do as well. And some people think that actually it requires an apology. If you don't have remorse, apology, acceptance of what's happened, repentance if you like, then forgiveness shouldn't even be on the table. Others see forgiveness as an act of self-healing. It's only to do with you. And if you wait for the person to say sorry, you'll be waiting forever. And that it's not about reconciling with the perpetrator. It's about taking hold of painful emotions and deciding to let them go. Margaret McKinney is a woman that I met early on in this project. Margaret's son had been abducted and murdered by the IRA. And she broke apart essentially. She was full of pain and despair, and many years after that, it was her favourite son, 22-year-old, and he had special needs. Now Margaret showed to me the whole very difficult journey of forgiveness, because she said shortly after, for a couple of years after he was abducted, she says, if I'd known who Brian's killers were, I would have gone out and killed their children. I wanted them to know how it felt. And that really summed up to me that actual forgiveness does not exclude anger and revenge. In the end, 21 years later, the body was returned to the house. She had a funeral and she began to heal. And she now said she'd like to forgive, she's ready to forgive. She feels that the offender deserves to be rehabilitated and restored. She said, I don't know who did it. No one's ever come forward. So therefore, I'm not able to forgive. And she's faced an extraordinary journey. This is Bud Welch, someone else I met in America in 2004. Bud's daughter, Julie, was killed in the Oklahoma bombing. This was caused by a young man called Tim McVeigh and his accomplice, who was very anti-government. And he planted a bomb in a huge truck and it killed 168 people, including Bud's daughter. Now, Bud's life, like Margaret's, absolutely shattered and fell apart. His job suffered, his relationship suffered, he started drinking. Every day, he would go to, this was then raised to the ground, but every day he would go to the site and he would mourn his daughter. And one day, he told me this, he said, one day I went and I thought, I have to do something different. What I'm doing isn't working. And as a result, he started campaigning against the death sentence in the whole of Oklahoma. He wasn't successful. Tim McVeigh was in the end executed, but he told me that a year before it happened, he found it in his heart to forgive Tim McVeigh. He said it wasn't a release for the perpetrator, but it was a release for him. And then he went on to meet Tim's father. And the two men shared a common humanity. They had both lost children, but in very different ways. And very movingly, I think, he said, you realise I had found someone who was a bigger victim of the Oklahoma bombing than I was. Because while I could speak in front of thousands of people and say wonderful things about Julie, if Bill McVeigh meets a stranger, he probably doesn't even say he's got a son. Joe Berry was someone I was in Rwanda with just this last week. Joe's father, she was talking to the victims of the genocide. Joe's father was killed in the Brighton bombing in 1984. He was a politician. He died along with 5 other people. And Joe met, Pat McGee was the man responsible. He was an IRA activist. And when he was finally released after the Good Friday Agreement, Joe met him. And ever since, over 100 times, they had gone and spoken in places like Rwanda and many places in the UK to talk about what can you do to resolve conflict, about healing the wounds of history, and about reconciliation. Now, going back to Norman Tebbit's letter to me, that was because on the 25th anniversary of the Brighton bomb, along with 1 or 2 politicians, I organised an event in the House of Commons. And I wrote a letter to Norman Tebbit to warn him, because Norman Tebbit had been injured in that bomb, and his wife permanently paralysed. And I knew that it would bring up a lot of pain. So he wrote back, and he wrote that letter, which was absolutely fair enough. And the reason why Joe carries on working with them and talking about reconciliation is because, let's stand together, she says, and I really believe this is very true, no matter which side of the conflict you're on, had we all lived each other's lives, we could all have done what the other did. Mary Foley is a woman that I work with a lot in prisons. Again, a very sad story. Her daughter was murdered in a party, house party. And Mary brings her story into prisons and she shares it with often men who have murdered. and it's very powerful. And she reads letters that she's exchanged with the perpetrator, the young woman who killed her 15-year-old daughter. And the reason why Mary's forgiven, this is very typical, is because she says, I knew that if I didn't forgive, anger and bitterness would turn me into a person Charlotte would not have liked. Another person, Arno Michaels, I met him last year. He's a news story, got over 100 stories on the website now. He's an American. He was part of the largest, really a skinhead Nazi movement, really, in the United States. And for years, he indulged in extreme violence against anyone who didn't have a white skin. Until, and this is so typical, he had a daughter, and he decided he didn't want his daughter to grow up like him. And he said something which really resonated with me, because he shows the power of unconditional forgiveness. He said, forgiveness to him now is a sublime example of humanity that I explore at every opportunity, because it was the unconditional forgiveness I was given by people who I once came to hate that demonstrated the way from there to here. And he's now started an organisation called Life After Hate. So, what have I learned in the course of this time of working on forgiveness? I've learned a hell of a lot. I've learned that forgiveness, if it was a colour, it would be grey, because it's so complex, and also because it sits between the two extremes of black and white thinking. I've learned that forgiveness should never be an obligation, because if it is, it re-victimises and becomes a tyranny. I've learned that, and this really came home this last week, I just came back from Rwanda, it really hit me that, in the midst of violent conflict, forgiveness is not applicable. It shouldn't really be talked about, because all people are concentrating on is survival, and they are traumatised. But in societies recovering from the divisions of war, healing, repairing communities, forgiveness is incredibly useful. And I've learnt that hate can often be translated as hurt, and particularly from my work in prisons, where we run a prison victim empathy restorative justice programme, I've learnt that hurt people go on to hurt people. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.